Hello gamers, Power Heal here, and today we're going to be talking about Transcendence, and we're asking the question, is it fraudulent? Okay, so for you guys that don't know what Transcendence is, it's the Priest Tier 2 set from Blackwing Lair. It has 8 pieces, and basically people have been asking me, how does this compare to the AQ BIS that you did in the previous video? So we're going to talk about that. I could have included it in the last video. I thought about it, but I figured it'd probably be best to make a separate video on it anyway. Like I said, just keep the videos a little bit shorter. And yeah, I think there's definitely a lot to say on this topic. It's certainly not a bad question. So we're kind of going to hop into it for the AQ tier. And then I'll probably remake this video for Nax, because people tend to ask the same question for Nax for different reasons. So we'll kind of do that in a separate video rather than try and wrap it up here, right? It'll be more time appropriate when we eventually release that one. So the first thing I want to kind of talk about here is, like, why are we even suggesting using this to begin with, right? Because if we look at the BIS list, basically, that I created in the previous video, you'll see that individually a bunch of the items are just stronger than the Transcendence pieces in a one-to-one comparison, right? So if you have pieces that are just stronger on the AQ BIS, then why would we ever, use Transcendence over that? The answer obviously has to lie in the set bonuses, and that is basically the core of the question. It mostly focuses on the 8-piece bonus, which we'll go over in a moment. I want to briefly talk about I think it's the 5-piece or the 4-piece bonus. This would be a cool bonus, the fade on hit, if it was 100% of the time. Since it's not, like, half the time you're going to have to fade anyway, which just makes it a lot less useful, because the problem is you're not fading a ton, right? So, if you were fading a ton, then maybe this would be more useful, right? Because you're getting just more chances where you don't have to actually press the fade button. But you pretty much know when you need to fade, right? And it's not happening that often. So even if this does proc for you, it's not really like that big of a boon. It happens a little bit quicker. It's just really not the end of the world, right? So this set bonus should be 100%, and in its current form, I don't really give it too much weight in terms of using the entire set. Now, the 8-piece. Okay, so your Greater Heals basically put a rank 5 renew equivalent on the target, and people are basically asking, is this worth it for sacrificing all the stats that you get on the normal BIS? And I kind of want to break this down into two. It's really kind of like 2.5, but there's really two kind of camps on this, or two thought processes I have. Okay, so one's going to involve when you are first coming into AQ and you don't have the BIS items. Okay, but I think more of what the questions I get are asking is Tier 2 the actual BIS in itself? Like, is it better than using the quote-unquote individual BIS pieces of gear in AQ? And this is a good question to ask, because obviously if that was the case, you'd want to save a lot of your prio in these individual pieces and just focus on maybe like weapons, trinkets, jewelry, and stuff like that, right? Because, you could just use your Tier 2 if you have the 8 out of 8. So we'll start first with talking about going into AQ. Just in case anybody's confused on that. And I think going into AQ, the 8 out of 8, the Transcendent set more in general is pretty decent, right? Because when we look, we'll kind of go through each piece really quick. So the helm, you're not really getting better than the helm before you go into AQ. This is like a side grade, in my opinion, like a turbo side grade. Helm is just pretty much better than this, unequivocally. Shoulders, again, you could use the ZG shoulders here, especially if you're using another piece of the ZG stuff to get the extra 22 healing, like the trinket or something. But ultimately, if you only had the trans shoulders, not a problem. Or if you really wanted to activate the set bonus, right? The robes of Transcendence, this is pretty comparable to everything else. It's a bit worse than something like True Faith Vestments in a guild where you're going to speedrun, because you kind of straight up lose you lose like about, what was it, like 18 healing, something like, how much, I don't know how much healing is on the, okay, so it's, yeah, so you lose like 16 healing and 6 MP5, okay, but it's not like the end of the world if you wanted to use the trans chest there. Bracer, Bindings of Transcendence, these are pretty good. Individually, I think they're actually kind of like closer to the Van Braces of Prophecy than people think, but you're kind of trading like 1 MP5 for 10-ish healing, something like that. So they're very, very close. Moving on to the belt over here, you don't have, I guess in this particular case, the Firemoth's Clutch and the Whipbind Cord are kind of better, and you can even maybe argue that the Prophecy Belt are better, but the belt is not insanely better than any of those, you know what I mean? Belt is probably one of the weakest slots for trans overall, as well as the gloves, I would say. The gloves just aren't really doing much for you because, we don't really care too much about crit. They don't have a ton of extra plus healing over other gloves. It's not really a good reason to use them in general. And then the legs are, just really good, so using those wouldn't be a problem. And then the Boots of Transcendence are pretty damn good if you don't have Boots of Pure Thought, right? So this set is absolutely fine going into AQ, and while I would probably not really care about using the 8 out of 8 set if I did have some of the off pieces, it might be worth it if you had like enough off pieces. So for example, like I'll show you a scenario where I would maybe not use 8 out of 8. So if I had, say I had True Faith Vestments, okay, I had Fire Mollusk Clutch, okay, I had Boots of Pure Thought, I don't know if all these gloves are from AQ, basically, yeah, I'd probably, if I had the Gloves of Prophecy, right? I may even see, in my personal opinion, I would put Van Bracers on, and then I would actually do Girdle of Prophecy, and I would run something like this going in there, and I'd have the 3-piece here, right? So that's where I'd get my 3-piece. I'd run the 2 3-pieces, and then I would use True Faith Vestments if I had it, and then Boots of Pure Thought for like the off piece. So depending on the pieces I had, I would prefer the 3-piece tier 1 bonus still, as well as just the extra healing and regen from some of these items. However, if you look at the healing, right, 11, 16, and then 108 mana per 5. Okay, if we switch some of these back out to go full trans, let's make sure we go. Just do all these, make sure we have everything. That's basically everything, yeah. So we don't gain really much more healing. We lose a little bit of mana per 5. We lose the other set bonus, but now we're gaining the 8-piece bonus. So for me, I think I'd personally prefer the stats. And that's really because I think the 8-piece bonus is highly overrated. Basically, if you've seen my hot video for druids, it basically falls into kind of like the same problem that the druids have, right? And it's a little bit worse because you don't really control much about this renew that gets put on, right? Now, technically, you're choosing the target of the greater heal, which means that that person will be the recipient of the renew, but you're not necessarily choosing the target with the intention of putting the renew on them after, if that makes sense, right? So if I'm a druid and I'm casting Rejuvenation, if I am going to use Rejuvenation, I'll have a specific reason and goal for why I pick X target for Rejuve. This is not really the case here, because what you're actually doing is you're selecting the target for greater heal, and now Renew is on the target. Now, another problem with this, okay, is you might be thinking, well, what about the tanks, right? Because if let's say you're, cancel casting greater heal on the tank, like that's not bad, right? I mean, you have renew on the tank, it might not be really doing too much most of the time, but it's, it's going to be there and it's free basically, right? And it is free in this case. Well, keep in mind, you are paying the fact that you've invested in the 8 set, right, as opposed to other gears. So it's not technically free, but I understand the idea, the philosophy behind that. But there's a couple problems. A lot of times, the first one will be that other people in your raid tend to like to cast Renew, I feel like. I tend to see Renew put on tanks on a bunch of these fights. It's honestly probably worth it to put Renew on the tanks on a bunch of the fights where mana's not going to be an issue for you. If you've watched me play Blackwing Lair kind of recently, I've been a bit lazy about it. So for things like Fire Maw, Ebon Rock, Flame Gore, especially if the fight is going to be a short fight, so maybe not Fire Maw necessarily, but definitely something like Ebon Rock and Flame Gore, where there's not going to be a ton of other damage and the fights are really short, it doesn't really hurt having the extra source of healing on the tank there, right? Even though most of the time it's probably not going to amount to anything because the tank is being spammed, it doesn't hurt to do. So if somebody else is doing that, I believe that rank 5 Renew, it shares the same restrictions, right, where you can't have 6 Renews on the main tank. That's just not how it works. You can only have 1. So the person who's going to be applying the Renew on the tank is probably going to be using a max rank, because there's really no point in using a lower rank, right, on a short fight. You don't have to worry about mana. So on those types of fights, it's just going to get completely overridden. So that's one problem. Now, you could say, well, yeah, but if I'm using the set bonus, why not just let me be the one who gets the Renew healing, right? But again, it kind of doesn't make sense, because it's like, if mana isn't actually an issue and you're able to put the external Renew up anyway, you might as well have the biggest one on the tank, because that's the one that's likely to make the biggest amount of difference. Okay, so the only case I feel like where this really works, even on a tank type of situation, is where you're putting this on a tank on maybe a fight like Twin Emps or something like that, right? That's a better use case, because you're probably not going to want to keep a Renew up for the entire fight. It might just be too mana intensive, especially if your guild doesn't kill the boss particularly quick, right? So I think that's a perfect opportunity for where the set starts to get a little bit of use. But again, it's how much use really, right? Because again, most fights, the bosses hit very hard. Okay, so Twin Emps, they can kill your tanks very quickly if you get behind on healing. So how often really is the tick of Renew that's not even close to a max rank, so it's probably going to be in the 200s per tick? How often is this really going to do anything? Now, keep in mind, people will say, well, it's just adding extra healing, right? But if we go back to our hot video, one of the arguments that I made against other hots still basically applies to this type of Renew. And that argument, in case you didn't watch the Druid video, is basically that unless your hot is actually saving somebody, then it's basically not really doing much outside of padding your stats, right? Because what it's doing is it's typically on a tank, you have tons of heals coming in, okay? So even if the hot ticks first before, let's say, your flash heal comes in, your next flash heal, or somebody else's flash heal, or somebody else's healing wave, or whatever they want to cast, okay? It's just going to make that flash heal or healing wave overheal by the amount that the hot ticked in most cases. Or if it's not going to make the first one that comes in overheal, it's going to make the next one, right? So it doesn't really matter how much healing it does per tick in a given situation, unless that's making the difference in life or death. And that's going to be very, very rare. Now, obviously, in this case, because you're kind of giving up comparatively less, because the Renew is just put on automatically and the only investment you need is the 8 set, then it's not quite as bad, okay, as in other cases. But just something to keep in mind there, right? It's not necessarily positively contributing to much. It's kind of giving you a very, very, very small chance of potentially saving the tank in a given scenario, okay, where this Renew tick is actually the difference, and it wouldn't have been on there before because you wouldn't have wanted to invest the mana in a full-fledged Renew. So that's one scenario where it's kind of useful, but again, not probably as useful as you'd like. Now, the other thing that I wanted to talk about there is the ZG trinket, okay? Because this is the other thing that kind of gets brought up a lot, is pairing the ZG trinket with the 8 set. And the reason for that is because the ZG trinket allows you to cast like faster greater heals, okay? Which means that you're going to get more of these renews out on more people quicker. So there's a couple things on that, right? The ZG trinket, if we can actually go and look at it here, I don't know if it's going to let us see the actual time. I believe it's at 2 or 3 seconds. It's not going to say, I don't think. Yeah, I think it's like a 2 or 3 second cooldown. I'm not entirely sure. No, sorry, a 2 or 3 minute cooldown. And it only lasts for 15 seconds. Okay, so there's a couple things about this. If you're using this on the tank, right, kind of doesn't matter, because now we're just kind of, like, the renew would be applied regardless of if you're using this or not, right? So the only real advantage to doing this is basically you're going to pop this trinket, and it's going to be like a tech pack scenario where, you know, a bunch of people are taking damage. You're basically trying to use your greater heal as now a flash heal, because its cooldown has basically been reduced to, I think it actually is reduced to basically the flash heal time, maybe a little bit more or a little bit less. I forget the exact value. And you're basically flash healing these people with a, you know, greater heal, and then you're putting this renew on them. This is a couple of issues, in my opinion, with the thought process of like why this is actually maybe not that good. Now, the original thought, it makes sense, right? It's like the intuitive idea to scale the effect of the 2 set by getting out more greater heals. It does make sense in principle, right? So the logic there is not faulty or anything like that. It's just the practicality of it is really what we want to talk about. So think about like the tech pack situations that you've done in Blackwing Lair, right? It doesn't have to be tech packs. There's a bunch of trash, for example, especially in the earlier part of a queue, that it operates very similarly to tech packs, where there's bugs that kind of charge and stuff like that, and they'll do, you know, like a lot of damage to maybe Warrior X, and you'll, you know, spot heal him up, and then Warrior Z takes damage, and you'll spot heal Warrior Z, and then Warrior F takes damage, and it's kind of like that, right? But you notice the problem is it's not really like any of these players in most of these scenarios are consistently taking damage. And typically the targets that are consistently taking damage are taking very high spike damage. So something like on the tech packs, right? The mage is the thing that's going to take the consistent high damage throughout the entire fight if they're going to take damage. But a hot isn't really going to help them that much because they're getting bursted down really fast, okay? And similarly, if you have a warrior who's continuing to constantly pull threat on something like a tech pack situation or some of the mobs in a queue, what's going to happen is, you know, they're going to get like bonked, and they're going to go down to like 20% HP. They're going to get bombed with heals. You know, they pull threat 4 seconds later, they get bonked again, they get shot back up. So they're basically maybe getting 1 tick or something like that of this renew hot, and then they're getting immediately spammed, brought back to full. There's not a ton of damage types, even in Blackwing Lair or in, you know, AQ40, where the rot is really a particularly strong thing. Okay, now maybe some fights like Fire Maw, there's a bit of a rot component there, right? So it would help on Fire Maw for sure. You know, depending on how you do your Visk strat, it can help, right? The thing is, on a fight like Visk for an AQ40, if you're doing it at a high level, people will just use the potion cleanse pot on themselves. I think you can even cleanse it before the first tick goes out. I'm not entirely sure on that. I know on Shaman you can basically cleanse the actual poison tick. So you take an initial hit damage from the volley, but you can cleanse the first poison tick if you immediately drop your totems. So in a good guild, theoretically, it's even going to be difficult to get value on fights like that. And keep in mind, in order for the renew to really do anything, you have to have greater healed the target as well, right? Now, you could say that, if you're greater healing any target, you're going to have residual healing on them with the renew, which is true, right? But you also could just be prayer of healing your group or something like that as a priest, right? So in situations like that where there is kind of rotting effects, it depends. Like, is it rotting your group? Because if it's rotting your whole group, if you have enough potential HPS to cast something like a prayer of healing, you're just going to do that instead of casting these greater heals. Okay, and another type of damage that I remember from AQ quite fondly is the packs where they put that the debuff on that deals a bunch of damage to the target and I believe people around them. But it's a type of rot damage, but again, everybody in your raid is going to be focused on those targets because there's not a ton of other things to heal usually while this effect is going on, right? So if everybody's paying attention and you have a relatively decent raid, those people should be getting bombed with heals. So yeah, your greater heal might land on them and, might do some healing, and then you might get some effect out of the renew. But, how much of an effect are you really going to get, right? And the other aspect of this is you're casting a greater heal, which in some cases is going to be more mana than your flash heal, right? Now, typically we think of the flash heal as being more mana efficient, and it is like per point of mana healed. But if you use, like, some people like to use really high greater heal ranks to then, apply the set bonus with the charm of healing, right? There's kind of multiple philosophies with the charm. I can make a video on charm, but there's like, you either use the lowest rank of greater heal, right? Or you can actually use like a really high one and really crank your HPS, but then obviously it's kind of like hurting your mana a bit, right? And keep in mind, it does reduce the cost of those spells, but it's not, 5% isn't a ton when you're cranking out like a rank 3, rank 4 greater heal on someone, okay? So, yeah, I mean, the trinket, or the, I would argue that the trinket itself is a good thing to have on Priest, especially if you're using it reactively, because it does allow you to respond to some situations that would be difficult to respond to in other cases. Like, it allows you to crank out an incredible amount of HPS through the use of like max rank greater heal on a 1.5 second cast time, okay? But not a lot of that is really related to the renew. So for example, like, the important part there is actually casting the greater heals themselves, not the renew that's left over afterwards. And the renew that's left over afterwards, in most cases, is going to be overheal still. There's kind of going to be very few cases where you really get to make super effective use out of that dot. So yeah, I think even for me, going into AQ40, I would not personally make it a priority to run the 8 out of 8 set, unless maybe I was like very close to having it finished, if that makes sense. So for example, like, let's say the only thing I had was like, I don't know, Boots of Pure Thar. Maybe the only thing I had was True Faith Vestments, right? And then I pretty much had all the other tier 2 gear, okay? And I didn't really have good alternatives to a lot of the stuff. Maybe I didn't even have some of the good tier 1 pieces that I'd personally like to run. In a case like that, using tier 2 is fine, right? Because you're basically not giving anything up, so anything you get from the 8 out of 8 is just extra. But I think what a lot of people tend to be asking is they can figure that out on their own, right? They're like, well, yeah, if it's not really going to be much worse for me in terms of individual pieces, I might as well run it. But what happens when I do have all the good pieces, right? Is it still worth running? And I would say I still don't even like it when I enter, although I think it's better when I enter. But by the time I'm leaving, or I have most of my bis, or like what I'm aiming to get out of the raid, I definitely don't want it. And I'm just going to show you some stats really quick. So this is the priest that we built, the bis one, from the last video. And you can see that we have 1195 healing, and 125 mana per second. Okay, and we'll kind of compare this over to the tier 2 priest. We're missing like quite a bit of healing, like was this 80 some healing, and we're missing 35 MP5. Now 35 MP5 in my opinion is kind of crazy. We're starting to get into similar territories now of like you're basically like losing a tier 2 3-piece bonus equivalent in terms of MP5. Now it's not quite that bad because we do gain some spirit, right? So we have 478 spirit here, okay? And we only have 403 spirit here. So we gain 75 spirit, okay? So we are gaining some of this regen back as spirit. That should be noted, right? We don't want to completely negate that, but we're still losing healing, right? The crit doesn't really change. It changes a very small amount, okay? And the health, basically the same. We do lose a little bit of mana, but remember, at this stage in the game in particular, you're typically not going completely on your mana bar, right? Which is why I think I mentioned in other videos, like something like this Robe of the Guardian Saint, although it technically is BIS, it's kind of like last on your list, right? Because when you're using this, you're really using it for the extra intellect, because otherwise you would just use the True Faith of Estimates, which means that, in a guild where you're not constantly remaxing your mana and constantly draining all of it, the extra 20-some intellect, you just don't get a ton of value out of it, like you would if you needed every last point of mana for a fight. So that's kind of like the stat difference you're looking at, and I did a little bit of math here, where so we have 35 mana per 5 difference, right? Now again, it's not going to be quite that, but we're just going to use this for illustration, where 35, and we have 12 ticks in a minute, okay? So that's 420 mana, okay? And then 420 mana, and we're going to times that by, let's say, a 40-minute AQ. That's probably going to be reasonable for a lot of guilds. For most guilds, it's actually probably going to be longer than that, okay? But I think that's a reasonable kind of estimate. And I think that if you go too long, now we're talking about guilds that they're stopping for mana all the time, right? So the MP5 might not be as useful in general. But we're talking about if you're trying to kind of run through the instance, basically W key through it, you're not really using speedrun strats, you're just trying to be fast, generally speaking, then you probably got like a 40-minute or so AQ40 on your hands. And that basically, so 420 times 40 minutes, it's basically 16,800 mana, right? And you can do a lot with 16,800 mana. That's almost 2 mana bars, right? 2 extra mana bars full of mana. And that's just from the difference of the 35 MP5. People don't realize that, but the MP5 over the course of an entire instance, it really adds up. A lot of times people think of MP5 in terms of a singular encounter, right? And it makes it seem quite weak because they're like, well, it barely gives me any mana back on this particular boss fight. It's so short, right? Why would I would obviously just want more healing for better parses or whatever. But if you're actually interested in getting the most you can out of your character throughout the entire instance run or run of an instance, then MP5 starts to really matter a lot more, right? And if you invest into MP5 to a significant degree, like I would say this is you're investing in it much more significantly than somebody would if they had full tier 2, right? And you would notice this difference in the overall healing. I'm very confident in that, absolutely. And so what are you exchanging for that roughly 17k mana? Again, it's not maybe quite that bad. Let's say it's like 14 or 15k when you account for the difference in spirit and stuff like that, right? What are you exchanging? Well, you're basically getting a 200 tick heal that very rarely is going to tick. You know what I mean? In the vast majority of cases where you're using your greater heal, it's probably not even going to tick, right? Because you're going to greater heal somebody to full, and then they're not going to need any more healing outside of that. right? And if you're using it on the tanks, in a lot of cases, it's just going to be blocked by a higher level renew. And then the other thing I kind of wanted to talk about is we kind of talked about using the the greater heal with the trinket, the ZG trinket, okay? But what happens when the trinket's down, right? So if you're trying to force greater heals, and this is like a quarterback that's trying to throw like into really, really tight coverage, I feel like, right? Trying to toss a 2.5 second greater heal into a spot healing situation on Horde side against 6 Restoration Shamans casting Chain Heal, especially once they get their AQ tier set and they're casting it at 2-second clips, and they're doing like a ton of healing. They have Heart of Fakar active, let's say, some of them, right? You know, it's going to be really hard to find a target where you're gaining even like 60 or 50% of your greater heal. So even if you're landing greater heals and you're doing some effective healing, if you're doing like 75% overheal on the greater heal in order to apply this renew to the target, that is probably not even going to tick once after that on them because they're now at full health and they're not going to get hit again, right? Or even if it does, it's going to tick, maybe once or twice or something like that and get you a little bit of that value back having casted the greater heal. Then it becomes tricky, right? So it seems a lot better when you have the trinket active. When you don't, but remember, that's only going to be for 15 seconds, okay? That's only going to be for 15 seconds, like every 3 minutes. Or 2 minutes, I think it's 3 though. And outside of that, you're going to have a hard time squeezing those greater heals in. So you don't really, I'm going to make a video on this on Paladin, actually. It's interesting that we kind of bring this up. But on Paladin, I feel like one of the things that can separate you, right, and make you a better player than some of your peers is knowing when to cast Holy Light, right? I've kind of always thought this way. And honestly, playing Paladin again through this release of Anniversary, I feel like things are almost even more competitive, and it's actually even harder to squeeze in Holy Lights than it was in like previous iterations of the game, right? Like in Classic 2019 and stuff like that when I played Paladin. So I really do think that, it's difficult to weave in these long cast heals. It just really is. And I find myself on Paladin a lot. Like in the last raid I did, I was just thinking like, I probably should just cast Flash of Light there, right? I think I just did complete overhealing. I got beat out by maybe like point some seconds, wasted basically the whole heal, and I could have targeted somebody else with Flash of Light, done a lot more consistent healing on them, right? And I think that's basically kind of the moral of the story, is that when you don't have these buffs to cast speed to make these larger heals viable, they honestly are very unwieldy and just very hard to use in the modern meta, especially because most of the time you are overhealing. Outside of like maybe the very, very top end of the spectrum, most time you are overhealing. So unless somebody is really going to give you the green light, where they're going to allow you to, make sure that you have targets for this renew, this rank 5 renew, then it becomes really hard to justify, in my opinion, trying to force it and shoehorn it into situations where it's probably not going to net you a lot of healing, and you're going to have to do a lot of overhealing or just spend a lot of mana unnecessarily to do not much effective healing overall. So I think in terms of a BIS scenario, definitely not like when you're in full BIS. I think when you're coming into the raid, it's more viable, but again, depending, if you have really good gear coming in, I probably still wouldn't use it. I would still even prefer using the 3-piece tier 1 when I enter into the raid. But if you don't have access to those things, or if you don't like the 3-piece tier 1, those could be reasons to use 8 out of 8. Because again, at the start of the instance, the pieces are just a lot closer to the actual gear that you have from Blackwing Lair. Like even the pieces like Boots of Pure Thought. So subbing out one piece like Boots of Pure Thought for Transcendence Boots, that's not going to make or break you, that 35 healing. And in that case, if that was the only thing you could swap out, right, you might actually be better just running the 8 out of 8 and the off chance that you do get some good procs. occasionally from your greater heal, right? But and in most cases, I think with most people's gear sets by now, when they're going in, I wouldn't recommend it. I think it's mostly for kind of like new players who've acquired a lot of their gear in Blackwing Lair, if that makes sense. If you've kind of been in a slot where you're like priest can sometimes be hard to come by, so sometimes you can get showered with tier gear. And if you're a new player that's kind of, you've been doing some Pug or Guild Blackwing Lairs, you've been picking up all the tier pieces other people don't need anymore, and you've built yourself an 8 out of 8 set, you don't really have much else, go for it. But I wouldn't specifically try and tailor your loadout to this or anything of that sort. And I think that's basically all I wanted to say about this. I'm trying to think if there's really anything else, but I think that covers it all. Like I said, I'll do another video on 8 out of 8 tier 2 for Nax, because there's kind of more cases. That's the last thing I wanted to kind of mention is, you can selectively and intelligently use the set, right? So it's not bad to have. It's never bad to have an extra tool in your toolbox, right? So if you're doing a fight like Firemaw, right, that maybe it takes your guild longer than it does for like a fast guild or something like that, that's a fight where, maybe there's value in using 8 out of 8, especially with the ZG Trinket or even without it. Certain other fights that you notice that there's ticking damage, or in some cases it's not even so much that maybe the fight is super suited for 8 out of 8 tier 8, but how your guild does the fight or how the fight is healed in your guild, you notice certain deficiencies, right? And you're like, oh, well, Renew could actually help here, or, maybe by the end of this fight, most people are and I'm going to get more value out of the Renew than somebody in a faster guild that kills the boss quicker would, right? So don't be afraid to adapt your response. Like, don't take what I'm saying here as the almighty decree from up high, right? If you see scenarios where you think it can be effective, try it, because it doesn't hurt anything, right? I mean, you try it, doesn't work, no big deal. Just don't use it again next time, right? So never be afraid to try and experiment things. And if you see use cases for this set where you think in your specific situation, your specific guild, it could be useful, then go ahead and try it out. And hell, report back, let me know in the comments situations that have helped you. Maybe we'll do another video or visiting it where we cover some of those cases. But I think overall, for most players that are in like pretty decent guilds, it's just not going to be a priority that you want to worry about using 8 out of 8 tier 2 in AQ40 overall. So that's basically my thoughts on it. Thank you guys for watching, and like, comment, subscribe if this helped you, and I will talk to you guys next time.